Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Knowledge is Power. My name is Ayanna Sloan, and once again, I'm here with my dynamic co-host, Gail King-Gibson. How you doing today, Gail?
Good, how are you?
I'm not sure. I think some of us are still reeling from the aftershock of the result of the elections. What do you think?
I would tend to agree with that. I think people are in general disbelief.
Yes, and that's exactly what we want to talk about a little bit today, which is what now?
Right.
Where do we go from here? The election results are in. Some people are dancing in the street because their candidate was successful. Other people are not so happy about the outcome of the elections. And actually, that's part of what makes this a democracy. Sometimes your guy wins, and sometimes your candidate does not. We want to talk a little bit about, what happened with the election. What does this mean now that Donald Trump is the president-elect? What does that mean for the country? What messages came out of this election? You think that's fair to say?
I think it's fair to say. I think that, obviously there was a lot of attention paid to this election this year, partly because of the statements that were being made by Trump. And as a result of that, you see people feeling unsafe, unhappy, fearful for their lives, fearful for the lives of their children. They're concerned about whether or not they are going to be allowed to stay in this country. And, regardless of how you fall out on the immigration issue, and again, it's another issue that kind of divides a lot of people. But these are human beings. These folks came to America because they wanted a better life. Albeit they came by illegal means. It's certainly something that we need to deal with, but my personal opinion is that if I were one of those folks, either Hispanic or Mexican, I would be concerned. I would be fearful for my future in America, not only from the government, but also from the individuals that have been somehow energized to be basically disrespectful and mean to their fellow human beings simply because they're of a different heritage. So, typically I think when we have an election, you obviously either your guy or your gal in this case is either going to win or lose. We've been through this, for all time. But this is, I think, Ayanna, this is different. And the reason why it's different is because in order for him to get into the White House, he literally brought out what I would consider to be the worst fears and attributes that Americans have. Things that we typically would, again, harbor in our hearts and not say to someone else, and we kind of, rationalize ourselves out of saying that internally and not letting that out. Now somehow it's acceptable to let it out. And I think it's great that, it appears over the last couple of days that Trump has decided he's going to change his tune. The problem is that he's already incited so many Americans to feel that way. I don't think it's something that he can walk back, and I don't think it's something that these individuals that have been energized by him are willing to walk back from. So that's kind of where we are today.
Well, I'm going to unpack some of that just because there was a lot in there. Yeah. And just in unpacking that, which I think is what we need to do as a country, is let's unpack what has happened. Because there were so many messages that, came out of the campaign trail, so to speak. What really is his position on immigration? What really is his position, for instance, on Muslims who are in this country? What really is his position on, the fundamental rights that theoretically, at least, certainly should be offered to all citizens in this country? And I think the question now becomes, who will we see once he, to me, takes that seat in the White House or in the Oval Office? Will he be the Trump that we saw on the campaign trail, who was certainly inciting so much, to me, so much divisive and incendiary language? He was using that so frequently. Or will we see a different Donald Trump? And that's one of the things, you and I mentioned a little bit earlier, is who is he? Who is he now going to be as president, and what's going to be his agenda? Because I'm just going to say this real fast, is that I don't personally believe that it was a monolithic group that had him elected. That there were different things that he said to different people that had them supporting his candidacy. Not everybody who voted for Trump, I believe, agreed with his, I think it's some of his divisive tactics. But there were people who voted for him who certainly, they were galvanized around those divisive tactics. But I don't think that's the voice of America.
I would tend to agree with you, and I've said this before. I love my Republicans. I know plenty of Republicans that I love dearly, and I don't believe them to be racist. And so I think for a lot of Americans, that's the disconnect, because now these are people that you ate lunch with, you had a drink with after work, and they voted for, supported this person who literally every day was espousing racist statements about people. Okay, and so we connect. I think it's just natural that people connect that. You say, if you voted for him, then you're obviously in favor of his policies, his mindset, his rhetoric. And so for average Americans every day, we are taking a look at each other and saying, well, do you really feel that? Do you like me? Are you a racist? I mean, we had gotten beyond that to some extent. Now, maybe it turns out we hadn't, but what you and I talked about earlier, and the reason why we decided to do this, a couple months ago, is it is clear that the problem in this country is that we don't talk to each other. We just don't. We make statements, but we don't talk to each other. We don't say, okay, so what do you mean by that? What's wrong with that? Why can't we do this? There's no conversation going on either side of this aisle, and that, I think, has to stop.
And I think, again, you always bring out such good points, because so many times, and people often are afraid, I think many decent people who may have voted for Trump were afraid to say they were Trump supporters, because that became synonymous with some of the most hateful things that he said. But there really were people who voted for him for other reasons. Some people were looking forward to his economic policy, even though that was never very clear what that was going to be.
Right.
But his, supposed or espoused economic policy, and some people were more in favor of that. Some people were I know a lot of people who are often labeled as so-called evangelicals, supported him because they thought, he more supported their platform or their views, and it had nothing to do with racism. It had nothing to do with wanting to deny people rights in this country. So there were people who voted for him for different reasons that had nothing to do with, I think, some of the incendiary messages that he sent out. But they were afraid sometimes, I think, or reluctant to say, yes, they would vote for him because they were afraid that they would be labeled as a racist. And I think we have to give people credit. We're not a monolithic group.
Well, people don't want to acknowledge that.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the issue going forward, I think, for the country is, I don't think you can put this genie back in the bottle. I think we're beyond that at this point. We've seen people protesting in the streets, and I've actually had conversations with some Republicans who've said, these people are stupid, this is dumb, and then that upsets me, because I know for a fact, had this election gone the other way, there would have been repercussions. Based on where the vote, the vote's pretty close. There would have been repercussions. We would be living the aftermath of his loss if that had been the case. And there would have been, I believe, there would have been protests. I believe there would have been calls for, for Hillary to be prosecuted. I think it would have been a different day. So here we are today. And so where do we go from here? Because, the presidency is on a much higher level. How does it impact us on a daily basis? How does it impact rank and file Americans? Because we're the ones that literally have to live with this.
Well, I think that one of the things we have to consider is that there was more going on the ballot than just the president. And we needed to really be looking at the House and the Senate, which people did not do. Because without change in the House and the Senate, with, unfortunately, the Republicans still having full control, a lot of people are more concerned because of what did not happen in terms of lawmaking, that the country was just almost like held hostage. And the country was held hostage because instead of being concerned about what's best for America, it seemed like so many of the lawmakers were more taking the position, we're just going to stop President Barack Obama, even if it hurts the country. And that to me is frightening. So we don't need to just look at, Donald Trump became president, but we made no changes in the House and the Senate.
Right.
So what's going to come out of the House and the Senate now? Are they now suddenly going to wake up and say, oh, okay, we need to actually consider making laws or passing policy
Right.
that would actually be beneficial to America?
Yeah, to your point, and I think that you know, a lot of people, we knew it when we were in it, but a lot of people have forgotten that while Barack Obama was in the White House for 8 years, he was basically stonewalled at every turn.
He was.
He proposed an infrastructure bill. He couldn't get anything done. And to me, so you elect senators and congressmen to go to Congress to represent you, and in my opinion, they did nothing while they were there other than prevent him from helping the American public. And so now we have a new day, and you know, the expectation is just forget about everything that just happened. We're moving forward, and we're gonna turn this country around. And so again, you know, when you lose, are you supposed to be a sore loser? Because that's what we had for 8 years. And you know, again, I got to say this about my Dems, we are the most forgiving people in the world, you know. And so I want us to continue in that tradition, but I do want us to hold individuals accountable. I want them to be, if they say they're going to do something in the House and the Senate, they should do it. We vote for these folks. We put them in office. We expect certain results. We never hold them accountable for the results until it's time for re-election. That's the only time we re-examine it. And I don't know of any job, you know, in America where you don't get a review after, you know, call it 6 months or 12 months, where they say, okay, this is what you said you were going to do. Let's see, you know, how it measures up to what you actually did. I think in terms of where do we go from here, I think we should usher in a new day where we actually hold our politicians accountable, not just at the ballot box. And I think what you see with the protests is, I think you're going to see a more involved, engaged public that's going to do more than go to the ballot box every 2 or 4 years.
Hopefully we actually see that, because that's one of the problems. That's one of the things that either is going to keep us from changing or that will help us change, is that we need engaged citizens. We need people to be informed about what's actually going on. Stop listening to sound bites. Stop being manipulated. And then it's unfortunate, because actually this particular election process was a good example of that. It is my opinion that people were manipulated through sound bites. That one of the things I'm going to give Donald Trump credit for is that they were excellent at marketing. They identified their target market. They knew what their constituents wanted to hear, and they galvanized people. Unfortunately, it was so often around a negative message, but they knew that people who actually had not voted in decades, that they could galvanize them by just, you know, crafting the right message, giving them, baiting them with something that made people believe that I'm going to help or empower you, even though I'm sure that's not going to happen. But it's this thing about manipulating the public without giving anybody any real information or answers, but baiting people and people taking the bait. That frightens me more than anything.
Right. Well, we don't look behind these statements that people make. You know, we should ban all Muslims from coming into the United States.
A very frightening statement.
Right. And so when you hear that, and then you kind of look behind it and say, well, what's driving that? Okay, well then, Islamic terrorism. Okay, we got that. So then let's actually look at the numbers. How many terrorist attacks have we had on U.S. soil? Obviously, we had a horrific event on 9/11, and there have been others. But I think if you look at the atrocities that have occurred in this country, in the United States, by homegrown individuals, they're not Muslims. But we don't focus on that, and we don't talk about addressing that, and we don't talk about banning those individuals. And to me, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you feel, and there's a legitimate concern, and obviously immigration laws should be used to effectively weed out individuals who have animosity towards America.
Sure.
There's no question about
Nobody's even arguing that.
No,
right.
that's not the issue, but it's not all Muslims. Let's be clear about that. Most of the Muslims I know are God-fearing people. They don't want to hurt anyone. And so I think it's unfair to law-abiding Muslims in this country and outside of this country to make those kinds of statements.
Plus, I think the other thing, along with everything you're saying, is so dangerous is that, and people have done this throughout history, unfortunately, it was done most effectively by Hitler. And that is, if you repeat a lie often enough,
it becomes true somehow.
Anybody will believe it. You know, people will believe it. We keep repeating lies. That all of the problems in the country is caused by this group or that group, and that is not true.
No.
There are times in the country when, in fact, we may have an issue that may have been brought about because, as you said, 9/11, which, according to the reports we got, was associated with, some kind of Muslim or Islamic activity. Okay, so that's a situation. It was horrific. We understand that. But out of that has grown such irrational fear.
Right.
And when you keep saying over and over again, the problem is this group or that, people don't actually look for other answers. They don't look for, wait a minute now, the problems that we have are more complex than that.
Absolutely.
That's not the only thing that we need to be afraid of.
Right. And to name a few, Sandy Hook, Columbine, Aurora movie theater.
Right.
I mean, the list goes on and on.
When innocent lives were taken and American lives.
And none of them were Muslims.
Right.
Okay.
None of them were Muslims. But nobody's afraid. Nobody's afraid. They didn't create a stereotype.
Right. Around that group of
around
individuals.
that kind of person who created that act. We don't have a stereotype that says, be afraid of this person because he, killed all these people at Columbine.
No.
We didn't now go out and then attack or profile every person who looked like that individual.
Absolutely.
We actually say this, which is horrible, this thing about the Unabomber and all this. There's a guy at work who actually resembles him, and we tell him to be careful, because if in fact they had profiled or created a profile around that, this guy would be a target, but we don't do that because we don't, unfortunately in America, we're only afraid of certain people.
Right. Well, we're led to believe that we should be afraid of certain people. And
said.
The bottom line is we are all members of the human race. We need to love and respect each other, regardless of what color we are. I don't even...
Or faith, whatever faith a person has, because what we're doing is reducing life to such terrifying, to me, beliefs around all these kind of people are evil or all these kind of people is good, and there's nothing that's further from the truth. You can be in a country where everybody looks alike and they still have all the same issues.
Right.
You could go to, certain European countries, they have some of the same issues and they all look alike.
Right.
In fact, most of the wars, World War I, World War II, they were fought among and between European nations and they looked alike. Mm-hmm. So it has nothing to do with what people look like, what their language is, what their faith is. People historically have fought one another. It's usually over economics, I'm sorry. It's over power.
Right.
And who wants power and who wants to gain power? That's usually behind most struggles. Mm-hmm. It's not about one group, but it's about how people look at power.
Right, but I don't think that again, it's getting people to look behind, look behind what's being presented to you and say, does this make sense?
Does this make sense?
Does this make sense? Or, I understand we're busy. You got to get kids to soccer games. You don't have time to do your own, investigation or get on the internet and Google a couple things and look at issues. But you should take the time because you're taking someone's word for gospel and you're acting on it without, verifying that it's true, that it's accurate. And, that's not the way to run a country. And personally, I think it's set us back in terms of the way that we deal with each other on an everyday basis. I think people are more cautious in their approach with one another, especially someone of a different race. And we had moved, to a large extent, we had moved beyond that. We had gotten people comfortable with one another. And now I feel like, we've taken, 20 steps back. And again, where we started with this, I don't think he can walk this thing back. I don't think he will be able to walk away from everything that he said. And I think that what we've seen with individuals protesting across this country, it's eerily reminiscent of what we've seen in foreign countries, in France, in in Germany, in where you have this constant civil unrest. That's not America. That's not America.
It hasn't been, and we don't want it to be. One of the things I actually wanted to share today, and I have to say it before I forget, is because when you break down fear, it's an acronym. And it's not original with me, somebody else came up with it. It's false evidence appearing real. And if we look at it that way, is false evidence appearing real? And I think that is what we have to be very careful about, is that that's what people are using. False evidence appearing real. For what purpose? And I'm going to give America credit. I think and I hope there will be people sitting around saying, wait a minute, we don't want our country to go backwards. We've made progress. We've become more inclusive. We've talked more about diversity and fighting for what America is supposed to stand for. It's been a slow process, you know. It hasn't something that has, happened overnight. But we believe the country is worth fighting for, and that we wanted to become the symbol of tolerance. We don't want to extinguish the lamp of liberty.
Right. And
we want to keep that flame burning,
right,
so that people feel you can come to this country, you can be safe.
Yeah, and as you know, I've always had a problem with the word tolerant because it implies that one group of individuals has the correct standard and they're willing to tolerate and live with everyone else, and that's not right.
It's actually a good point.
It's not tolerating, it's literally accepting.
It's accepting. It's a better word.
That we are different, but we are all members of one race. That's it, plain and simple.
It's called the human race.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else to it. And so, if I dislike somebody, I'm going to dislike you because of what comes out of your mouth, not because of the way that you look. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so I feel like all of the gains that we've made, over the last 40, 50 years have just been, literally flushed.
Well, I'm optimistic because, first of all, the thing that concerned me, and Gail and I, we don't have time to get into this today because we talked about the whole Electoral College and all that he actually didn't win the popular vote, which means that not all Americans agree with the message.
Right.
Yes, we understand how the process works, so nobody needs to write us about that. We understand that. But when they looked at it, actually now, over 400,000 Americans actually had voted for Hillary Clinton. So she actually led the popular vote by over 400,000, right, or at least 400,000 they've counted now. So I'm saying not every American surely didn't agree with his message.
Right.
There are still Americans, I think, who are willing to say, hey, this is how we want our country to look. We want a country where there's still hope. We want a country where there's still a message of inclusion. Unfortunately, there wasn't a wide enough gap for her to become the president.
Right, and I think that's the other part of it is as we said, education and people trying to understand how is it possible that she could have gotten more of the actual votes.
Of the popular vote.
Right, but he became president, and it's because of our process. It's the Electoral College. It's so many states are assigned so many votes based upon its population size.
Exactly right.
And that's what happened, and that's our system, and that's the one we live with, and it's probably never going to change, but I don't.
And they do that countywide,
right,
which makes a difference.
And I don't want people to then just say, okay, well, fine, now that I understand that, I'm going home and I'm not going to do anything anymore.
That's right.
I do think that the point is that we should all be more engaged in the process.
I agree.
We need to understand these positions that presidential candidates take. When I watched all of the debates, I listened to both sides.
Yes, she did. She watched them faithfully.
I admit that I'm a devout Democrat, but I'm open and willing to listen. And so we've talked about this, the concept of, and I think we're going to try and have a show on the concept of trickle-down economics.
That's
and
right.
Why so many people would find that concept appealing as a way to energize, expand, grow, lift the middle class. To me, that is just not a direct way to go about helping a group of individuals, middle and lower class folks that are really struggling. It doesn't make logical sense to me that you would somehow empower those that are already well off and give them more tax breaks and therefore more wealth, and somehow that is going to, as I say, or they say, trickle down to the middle class and the lower middle class. It just, and you have quite nicely explained to me why it does work. And again, I still, I think I just don't buy that. I think if your intent, if the government's intent is to lift the middle and lower class individuals up through the ranks, it shouldn't be done indirectly. It should be done directly. It shouldn't, because anything could happen that would prevent those individuals from allowing that wealth to trickle down.
Well, we don't have much time. We did talk about, maybe bringing in an economist and maybe, somebody on the Republican side to explain their views about that. My view basically is that we look at the global economy and the national economy, because we actually are creating, and strengthening the middle class in other countries, because we're now in terms of global economics. What we'd like to do is continue the conversation, and also what we really encourage everybody to do is let's look at the policies that are now going to come out of this administration. What are the environmental policies? What are the economic policies? Because that's what we look at, what happens now. It's all about civil liberties. It's also about economics. What's going to happen with the environment? Who are they going to put in the different cabinet positions? How will that affect the country, and what's going to happen? I'm not sure we know who Donald Trump is yet. I was telling Gail earlier, there was Donald Trump on the campaign, there was Donald Trump before the campaign, and now we'll see who is Donald Trump after the campaign. We don't know yet, but we're going to keep having the conversations. We're going to keep, hopefully, giving you information to keep strengthening the country, trying to bring all of us together as one country. You agree, Gail?
Yes, yes, critical.
And protect the whole process of democracy, because what we see now is that in a democracy, as we said in the beginning, sometimes your guy wins and sometimes he doesn't, and how do we continue to work together as one country regardless of the election outcome? Would you agree?
I agree, and again, as you point out, we live in a global economy, and obviously there are countries around this world that would love nothing more than the U.S. to denigrate into some type of civil unrest, and we know that this country cannot survive divided. We've been down this road before.
All right, so thank you so much for watching Knowledge is Power, and we look forward to continue to have the discussion with you.